The Pulses of Development, Six Economists and the World They Made, authored by Professor David C. Engerman. This gathering brings together some of the most distinguished minds in public policy, economic thought, and diplomacy. Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, Dr. Manmohan Singh Ahluwalia, and the author himself, Professor Engerman, whose combined insights promise to animate our understanding of development, both as a historical journey and as an enduring challenge. We are truly honored by their presence here today. Their intellectual stature, lived experience, and continuing engagement with the challenges of our times command the deepest respect and admiration from all of us. Professor Engerman's book is a deeply researched and compelling chronicle that reframes the narrative of the post-war development. It shines a necessary light on six extraordinary economists: Amartya Sen, Manmohan Singh, Mahbub ul Haq, Jagdish Bhagwati, and Rehman Sobhan, and Lal Jayawardena, who emerged from the colonial South Asia to reshape the global discourse on poverty, inequality, and growth. Trained at Cambridge, yet rooted in the realities of the global South, these economists did not merely theorize from ivory towers. They wrestled with the pressing dilemmas of their times, challenging the dominance of Western ideologies by proposing context-sensitive, pragmatic approaches to development. The idea that development should be judged not by GDP statistics alone, but by the lived realities of the people, by their freedoms, opportunities, and agency, is as urgent today as it was in the era those visionaries lived and worked. Their intellectual journeys remind us that the quest for equality and social justice is inseparable from the project of nation building. We are especially fortunate to have with us today Dr. Manmohan Singh Ahluwalia, whose contributions to India's economic policy architecture over several decades have left a lasting legacy. As a visionary, reformer, and chief architect of India's liberalization era policy reforms, his voice has shaped the evolution of inclusive growth frameworks, both within India and in global development fora. We are equally privileged to welcome Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, one of India's most respected diplomats and thinkers on strategic affairs. His nuanced grasp of global geopolitics and his ability to connect national policy to international realities have made him an authoritative voice on India's foreign and security policy in the 21st century. Our conversation will be moderated by Shri Suhas Borkar, a passionate advocate of public discourse and citizen media, whose decades-long engagement with issues of equity and sustainability aligns seamlessly with the values underpinning this work. I extend a warm welcome to each one of our speakers and to all of you for what promises to be a stimulating and timely discussion. Thank you for joining us this evening, and let's move forward to the conversation that awaits. I invite Mr. Borkar to initiate the conversation.
Good evening to all of you. Sorry that there was some confusion because this whole program of David has been arranged remotely. You know, he was in communication from Yale, and he was very keen that it be held in IIC, and so there is an IIC connection. He wrote to me that I would be especially honored to introduce the book at IIC, where I conducted a number of the interviews which were part of my research. David did not tell me then that 4 of the 6 economists he had written about were veteran members of IIC: Jagdish Bhagwati, Amartya Sen, Manmohan Singh, and Rehman Sobhan. 3 of the 4 were in fact life members of the center. There are 3 Stephanians here on the table discussing 6 economists who studied at Cambridge. There is a connection there too. This is going into the genesis of St. Stephen's College, which was set up in 1881 by the Cambridge Mission, a group of dons from various Cambridge University colleges, led by Samuel Scott Allnutt, who became the first principal of the college. I have personally interacted with 3 of the 6 economists. I had the opportunity to interview Rehman Sobhan on camera in 1998, traveled with Dr. Manmohan Singh in 2006 to South Africa as part of the media team, and hosted him many times later at IIC, and interacted with Amartya Sen when he was invited by Speaker Somnath Chatterjee to deliver the inaugural Hiren Mukherjee lecture in the Central Hall of Parliament in 2008. Now, before I ask David to take the floor, a question which we must ask ourselves and the panelists is, what is striking you the most of the book? Now, that bit later. David, please.
Thanks so much. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here. I met many of the people I spoke with. I interviewed about 100 people for this work, and many of the Indians I had a chance to meet here in the dining room or in the cafe at IIC. So I'm particularly proud to do it here. I'm also proud to and pleased and honored to see people whose work, whose perspectives and advice I received over the course of working on this project, and really honored that they're able to attend. I did also want to thank in particular our panelists and Shuas Borker for the arrangements. To some degree, do you want to put the slides up? Yeah. To some degree, to some degree, the 6 need no introduction, but the first thing I do want to explain before I turn to introducing the 6 is to introduce the term apostles. It's an inside Cambridge joke. There's an organization, a literary society that dates back to the early 19th century called the Conversazione Society. But when it was founded, it had only 12 members, and with, I would say, typical schoolboy humor, it was nicknamed the Apostles. There are now more than 14, have been more than 14 members, but it still maintains the name. 2 of these 6 were members. 2 of these 6 economists were members of the Apostles. I'll leave it to you to guess which 2. But I think, in a broad sense, all 6 of them were apostles. They all debated, formulated, and disseminated and applied development doctrine over their long and productive careers. And as I introduce them as the apostles, I want to emphasize that even though I'm grouping them together, of course, they all studied together at Cambridge between 1953 and 1957, that they are far from cut from the same cloth. They are themselves very different. They held very different views of economics. They had very different careers, some more oriented towards scholarship, some towards policy, and some mixing it up. And they moved between a kind of dazzling array of locations around the region and, in fact, around the world over their careers. Without further ado, let me just offer a quick kind of recap of the 6 to emphasize a couple of points here. I apologize if the slides get a little funky. I had a graduate student set it up, and I can't fix it. Of course, I'm going alphabetically, I should say, so I'll start with Jagdish Bhagwati, a prolific international economist whose scholarly work on the role of trade in economic growth, but also in particular the political economy of trade, have made him a kind of perennial contender for the Nobel Prize. He has not yet won the prize, although he did receive the prize on an episode of the American TV show The Simpsons some decades ago. He loved the role of contrarian, promoting trade when most in India were skeptical, promoting devaluation while others were, I would say, allergic to the prospect of it. By the 1990s, he became a kind of polemicist for globalization, to the point that he appeared with Ralph Nader, arguing against Ralph Nader at the so-called Battle in Seattle, the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in 1999. The next, moving alphabetically, is Mahbub al-Haq from Pakistan. And here I was really struck, as I did the research for this, by his different reputations in the West versus in Pakistan. In the West, he's seen as a liberal lion, helping push the World Bank to the left with basic human needs, and then formulating and writing the human development reports, as shown here, for the UNDP development program in the 1990s. In Pakistan, though, many young scholars, at least younger generations, see him as a dedicated employee of right-wing dictators and are particularly disturbed by his work in General Zia-ul-Haq's cabinet in the 1980s. The third, Lal Jayawardena from Ceylon, Sri Lanka, had a variety of both domestic and international roles. Domestically, he helped formulate his country's first economic plan, and then not too many years later helped formulate the liberalization policies in Sri Lanka in 1977. He also served his country as a diplomat in both Brussels and London over his career. He's probably best known for his culminating position at the UN as the founding director of a leading think tank, WIDER, in Helsinki. But he'd actually been involved in international organizations for decades even before that, working at UNCTAD, along with Dr. Singh, actually, in the 1960s. And then for an important, again with Dr. Singh, in the 1970s, an important IMF, a neglected IMF committee in the early 1970s. Professor Sen, of course, in this crowd needs no introduction at all. A prolific and highly original thinker with an illustrious and peripatetic career. Photos here of him receiving the Nobel Prize in Economics, which he won in 1998, and his being greeted on a sort of victory tour after the Nobel Prize in later that year. Dr. Singh, of course, over the course of the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, held every single important economic post in India, and in this way was active in international organizations, often as Indian representative. Of course, he too worked for UNCTAD in the mid-1960s. His career culminated, essentially two culminations, as Minister of Finance, of course, in 1991, as well as 2 terms as Prime Minister. The next, and by no means the last figure in here is Rehman Sobhan, originally from Pakistan. Of course, he is the only one of the 6 not to win first-class honors and not to earn a doctorate. Then again, he's also the only one of the 6 who appeared on his government's hit list for potential assassinations. He was drawn to activism after his time at Cambridge and was active with the Awami League over the course of the 1960s, which won him this honor, his government's highest honor of being deemed an enemy of the Pakistani state, and then played an active role in bringing Bangladesh creating Bangladesh out of Pakistan's East Wing. He shown here with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. He spent 2 years after independence working on economic policy in Bangladesh's Planning Commission, and then the next 35 years and counting as a powerful voice for equity and social justice in Bangladesh. So these 6 were too old to be Midnight's children. They were born between 1932 and 1936. Some friend of mine has joked we should call them Midnight's teenagers. I'm not sure I would go with that. I would note that they had varied interests initially. Amartya Sen first in Sanskrit and then math and physics. Manmohan Singh actually briefly studied medicine before turning to economics. They all ended up there, I think, something that's trying to answer questions about the world they saw around them, immediately around them. Dr. Singh recalled a line from Minu Masani that had piqued his interest and gotten him interested in economics, that India was a rich country with poor people. Jagdish Bhagwati told me that his desire to understand and solve poverty was based on his own experiences in growing up in India. I'd also want to underscore something that's easily forgotten today as we criticize the Hindu rate of growth, the license permit quota Raj, et cetera. And similar criticisms are levied about the developmental estate in Pakistan or in Sri Lanka. To say this in this mid-century moment, these criticisms are not without merit, but they miss, I think, the sense of excitement, of opportunity, of possibility that in the decade or so after independence, when this group was learning, were enrolled in schools and universities, first in South Asia and then beyond. It's in this sense, I think, that led Rehman Sobhan, who I would say is the group's designated optimist, to open his memoirs with the memorable lines from William Wordsworth. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Sobhan doesn't quote any further in the poem, but there's a description of it as the world was, as they believed it, as plastic as they could wish, meaning not that it was shoddy and disposable, as we might take plastic to mean today, but that revolutionaries, in Wordsworth's case, the French revolutionaries, had the chance to mold the world with their own hands. By the time Wordsworth wrote these lines in 1809, he had seen the revolution he had endorsed turn into counter-revolution under Robespierre and Napoleon. And even as he regretted that direction, he wanted to remind readers of the promises and the premises of 1789 and how they were indeed worthy of celebration. Optimism ran rife in South Asia in the 40s and 50s. You could see the plasticity, if you will, of economic life meant that it would no longer be economic life in the former colonies would no longer be subject to colonial edicts, or, for that matter, left to the vagaries of the invisible hand. Instead, it would be shaped by human direction. Economic planning, thus, was the order of the day. G.D. Birla commented on India's fever for planning during World War II, as you can see from here. Planning, of course, was the name of the game across South Asia and, in fact, in the wider world, not just in the Soviet Union, of course, but there were French plans, I've shown here Sudanese and Tanzanian, but almost every former colony had a plan immediately before and another one immediately after gaining independence. And even the United States, as decentralized as it was talking more about planning then in the 1930s and 40s and even into the 50s than one might expect. This was the high tide of Keynesian economics when the debate was over when and how governments should be involved in the economy, not whether they should be involved in it. So these 5 of these 6 began their studies in South Asia, in their home countries. They started often at new institutions, the Delhi School of Economics, founded in this era. Lal Jayawardena went to the University of Peradeniya. The university was so new that when it opened, they were still awaiting shipments of blackboards and beds for the dormitories. Somehow the group made do. Specifically, an interest in economics. There were new economics journals created in these countries as well, in all 3 of these countries, suggesting just the way the moment was so rich with possibility. These 6 all arrived at Cambridge in 1954, give or take 1 year. And of course, Cambridge had a long tradition of educating South Asian colonial subjects. Nehru was shown here at graduation in 1910, and then actually with the Cambridge Majlis, the South Asian Student Society at Cambridge, in 1955. Lal Jayawardena is the second from the left, and Rehman Sobhan with the mustache is second from the right in this. And of course, there was a generation, a kind of cusp generation studying Cambridge just before or just after the war, some of the region's most distinguished economists. Thus, by the time the apostles had arrived, again, 1954 plus or minus a year, Cambridge had, I would say, not the best, but certainly the most storied economics faculty in the world. It had hosted the last 2 revolutions in economics, the neoclassical revolution of the late 19th century and the Keynesian revolution of the 1930s. The apostles themselves, here are some of the faculty they worked with, worked very much under the shadow of Keynes, who I show here with a sort of spectral presence. they all worked, irrespective of their politics, they all worked closely with neo-Keynesians who offered a full-throated and fully theorized challenge to neoclassical economics. They did labor, as I say, under the ghost of Keynes. In fact, one observer said that he would attend seminars in the early 1960s, so over 15 years since Keynes had died. And someone would ask, well, what would Maynard say? And then people would reply as if they expected him to walk in the door at any minute. To the best of my knowledge, that never happened. The post-Keynesians were led intellectually by Joan Robinson, intellectually strenuous, who Amartya Sen described as being vigorously intolerant, who inspired all six of this group, irrespective of their politics. While the neo-Keynesians thought that they ran the show, there were plenty of others. On the left, Maurice Daub was actually a card-carrying member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. When he was first offered the job, he told the hiring committee that he wanted them to know that he was a party member, and if they felt that they needed to rescind the offer of employment, he would understand. They said, well, as long as you give us 2 weeks' notice before you set an explosion in the chapel, then we'll be fine. No explosions took place. And in fact, he's remembered as a dreadfully dull lecturer by a number of the people I spoke with. On the right was Harry Johnson, a trade economist with more than a passing resemblance to King Henry VIII. He was a particular inspiration to Jagdish Bhagwati. I have a folder of his correspondence, Johnson's correspondence with Bhagwati, that's probably about an inch, it's almost as thick as the book, I guess I would say. The apostles learned plenty of economics here, and they learned that economics was an argument. They saw this argument taking place in actually a sort of take-no-prisoners form. It may have been abstract or even abstruse, but it was heated and occasionally ugly. They also learned that theory was rooted in efforts to solve practical problems, and this is a theme I bring throughout the book. No less an economist than Schumpeter described Keynes's ideas of the 1930s as, quote, English advice born of English problems. And I think that's really important to see that this is something that they did take from it. There were, however, a number of things that they didn't learn at Cambridge. They didn't learn mathematical economics. The economics faculty was more or less fully resistant to mathematics before about 1960. I think it's for this reason, actually, that Amartya Sen described coming to Cambridge as actually a letdown over his presidency college training before that. Another thing is they never learned anything about South Asia, even though the economics tripost, which they participated in, half-century earlier had an entire exam field on Indian famines. There was no course offering and precious little evidence of any readings on South Asia. And this in spite of the fact that a number of their faculty, including Joan Robinson and Maurice Daub, had visited India on many occasions. And Joan Robinson and her husband and colleague had in fact lived in India for much of the 1920s. Another thing they didn't learn was development economics. Now, it's a little bit unfair to blame Cambridge for this. There was no university in the West that offered a program, even more than a course, on development economics at the time. There were scattered articles here and there, but that was about it. Ironically, this last point opened up the opportunity for them, and I think they benefited from the lack of development economics, is they learned a broad array of economic subjects and had the chance to apply them in a way that if they were restricted to one field in development economics, they would not have had the chance to do. They built a fairly robust toolkit to apply to questions of development. These six dominated the Cambridge economics studies in their era. 5 of the 6 earned first-class honors. The 6th came in with an upper second. As my kids would say, they owned the Adam Smith Prize for the best economics paper. 3 of the apostles won the prize. 2 others won honorable mentions. This success led them to top grad schools in the United States and the United Kingdom. If we account for transfers, there were 2 each who went to Oxford, Cambridge, and Yale, and 1 to London School of Economics and 1 to MIT. Not too shabby, I would say. all of them, I think, were determined to solve fundamental problems of their region, poverty and inequality. I should note, though, that while they all observed poverty, observed poverty at close hand, most of the apostles, in fact, all except Dr. Singh, were raised in relative comfort. Jayawardena's family was upwardly mobile, so by the time he was at the university, they were relatively prosperous. But the purpose of this book, Apostles of Development, is not just to recount 6 interesting lives, although I do want to do that, but to interpret the global history of development, running more or less from the 1940s through the sort of the end of their active careers in the 2000 teens. And this seems a kind of propitious moment for stock taking in development, not least because the sort of horrendous headlines from Washington about the kind of wanton destruction of USAID. But below that headline is a general retreat from development happening in the countries of the West that had been firmest supporters of it. UK, Netherlands have all cut back, not quite as dramatically, shall we say, as the United States, but cut back nonetheless. I just want to make a couple of points in closing that emerge from the book. One is that development, I'm going to skip over the historians love to talk about other history books, but there's no reason for that here. Love to talk, right, that development has too often been told as a global North story, the one that emanates in London, in Washington, in Bonn, perhaps in Moscow, maybe Paris. But I want to suggest here that telling this story here shows that development was a global South project. Development aid, to be sure, flowed from north to south. But the ideas, the impulses, the agendas were very different. Development economics and the larger field of international development was a reaction to conditions in the global South that led to actions undertaken by and in the global South, shaped by ideas emerging from the global South. There's one kind of qualification to this, is these 6 apostles show that the distinction between North and South got to be very hard to draw, right? All of them traverse this boundary between North and South frequently over the years. And the final point I want to make is that looking at the story this way helps us rethink the relationship between theory and practice. We often tell the story as economic theory is formulated and then applied. I actually want to reverse that. So this is one of the first books to appear on history of development, focuses on Walt Rostow's modernization theory and shows how it shaped these different U.S. institutions. But I want to suggest that theory actually followed from practice. Theories emerged as efforts to solve practical problems, right? I don't really have time to go into examples here, but I do want to suggest that at every stage, whether it is kind of the central planning as an effort to solve problems, shortages of capital, whether it's development assistance as a contribution, is the answer to this, right? As the answer to it, creates its own problems of aid dependence. In the 1970s, there's a turn to the left across South Asia and, in fact, in the wider global South. This begets, I think, budget deficits that it turned into a debt crisis in the 1980s, a solution to which is structural adjustment. And further, the human development as a category didn't just come from Amartya Sen's ideas and Mahbub al-Haq's energies, although they obviously mattered tremendously in this, but it was a response to the cutbacks, the budget cutbacks that came with structural adjustment over the course of the 1980s. And so this is a story told through these six figures, a story of problem and solution, of crisis and response, and then of new crises and new responses. And it's at that very broad level that I think I'll leave the talk here and look forward to the comments. Thank you.
Before I ask Shiv Shankar Menon and Montek Lualia to take the floor. I come back to the question, what is striking to you about the book? And I have a very short answer. It's the real world problems solving over ideology. A striking feature of David's argument that development did not originate from textbooks, but from practical context-specific efforts to address poverty and inequality. These economists tackled urgent challenges such as India's economic liberalization, Manmohan Singh, Sri Lanka's trade reforms, Jayawardena, or Bangladesh's equity policy, Sobhan, with hands-on solutions, often navigating Cold War geopolitics. This pragmatic approach contrasts with rigid ideological frameworks, highlighting the adaptability of global South thinkers. Now that takes me to a very small story that's by Richard Lambert, former editor of the Financial Times. He says, as India's finance minister, Manmohan Singh visited Financial Times London offices in the early 1990s to discuss his reform program with Martin Wolf and me. Martin asked why he hadn't made what seemed like a perfectly obvious policy change, something to do with capital flows, I think. Yes, Martin, replied Manmohan Singh quietly. I understand the economics, but the difference between you and me is that if you make a mistake, you can correct it in your next column. If I make a mistake, 20 million people die. For a moment, even Martin Wolf was lost for words. Over to you.
Thank you for asking me to speak here. I'm not quite sure who I should thank for this, because I really feel like an interloper. You know, I studied ancient history, and here I am talking about a book about 6 economists, among economists. David? Okay, I'll blame David for this. But I guess one reason why I'm here is because this is really quite a remarkable book. It's a book that actually makes sense even to a layman like me, with a complicated dismal science like economics as its subject. By sheer chance, I was lucky enough to have worked with 3 of the 6 apostles and know indirectly about the 4th. Because the book actually uses biography to bring history alive in a very useful way, I think in an accessible way. It's packed with detail, with telling anecdotes, and it's something that but it's more than just a biography of 6 eminent South Asian economists who happened to study almost simultaneously at Cambridge. They each affected the course of the development of their own countries, but also of the discipline itself. They created an entire discipline, development economics. And that's saying something at a time when it was much, much more difficult, I think, to do so, actually. And so what you have in the book is therefore a history of development, a history of economics, and it also, to my mind, serves the purpose of showing to what extent, and I quote from the book, shows how much the global South shaped the global enterprise of development. It was not just the outcome of the Cold War, of some competition between the superpowers, or a new form of colonialism. There were parts of that, but that wasn't what actually created development economics and actually the practice of what we saw in terms of development. So let me tell you what struck me when I read the book, and you can then later tell me how wrong I am. You can maybe question the choice of the 6. I mean, what about your own slides? I think showed Gamini Korea, Dharma Kumar, showed, various I.G. Patel, for instance. But these 6 do actually stand out, even though, as David mentioned, 5 of them came from relative privilege in their own societies, apart from Dr. Manmohan Singh. But they actually made it on the power of their own intellect, their own talent. There was no guarantee. The privilege didn't guarantee. It might have guaranteed some initial access, but that's it. But after that, what they did was really on their own. And it made me ask, where are today's Manmohan Singhs, Mahbub al-Haqs in South Asia? We must be the world's most prodigious wasters of talent when you look around us at what we're doing among ourselves. And it really made me wonder, could we do this again? I mean, and what would it take? I'm not really sure. So I would say, please read the book and come to your own conclusions on this. Secondly, what they all had in common was a willingness to get their hands dirty, to participate in politics, either directly or to take strong political stands on issues of the day, on the daily issues. They could have chosen the comfort of the ivory tower. But this idea of a liberal university where you could pursue your discipline in peace, cut off from the rest of the world, this wasn't enough for any of them, even though many of them came from privilege. They chose actually to engage in politics or to take political stands. This made many of them controversial at home. Mahbub al-Haq, for instance, certainly. And politics is a dirty business, whether you like it or not. And it is a hard business for people to work in. And yet they chose this. And I found that quite remarkable, the sheer courage and that it took to do so. All the ones that I knew, Dr. Manmohan Singh, Lal Jayawardena, Mahbub al-Haq, for instance, thought as South Asians. And this is also remarkable. It's rare today. It's hard to find scholars of that eminence, of that global quality, who are thinking and acting as South Asians. Not that they were any less patriots than anybody today, but they were cosmopolitan in their thinking. And as David said, they could cross the borders between North and South, but also the borders that the multiple partitions of South Asia in the 20th century created. They could cross them easily and made them permeable, and certainly use the power of their intellect to look beyond these. And that is something. I mean, for me, that really hit me. What their lives proved, to me at least, is that ideas matter, especially in times of transition and of change, which we face again now. It's really a supreme irony when you read the book that the World Bank, the IMF, originally designed as pure financial organs of the North, were turned first to structural adjustment, then to human development, to basic human needs, and into development institutions by their work. In fact, they are the ones who made this. They worked, not just them, of course, they worked with the US to do so. It's the only other analogy I can think of is the UN itself, which its founders, like Churchill and Smuts, established as an organization to perpetuate imperial structures and power politics. And yet, the combination of countries like India and the Global South and the US managed to turn the UN into an instrument of decolonization in the 50s and 60s, something that would have horrified Churchill and Smuts and the others. I mean, these are the ironies of history, and it's worth remembering the irony that this can be done if you are prepared to play politics. And for me, that's the lesson that I really drew from the book, that it is possible to be optimistic about change in times like this, and that ideas matter. So, of course, this is a book that leaves you wishing for more. I wish there were more in the book about the spouses. The ones that I knew or know are really formidable people in their own right. But, I also think that some of the broader global significance of what they did is important. I remember, for instance, in 2009, before the April G20 summit in London, which actually saved the world from another Great Depression. I remember Gordon Brown came to see Dr. Manmohan Singh in the hotel. You remember that afternoon? We were told 20 minutes, that's all he has. So he came in for 20 minutes, conversation went on for I think 3 hours. And for flies on the wall like me, it was like an education, a master class in economics, in how the world worked and how to fix the world economy. And sure enough, the next day, that's what the G20 did. I really think that sort of influence and ability that Dr. Manmohan Singh, I think Gordon Brown, for instance, is underestimated for what he did for the world economy. That sort of thing, I wish there were a little more of that, of the global part of beyond the development economics. But you know, this is unfair. To ask for more from a book that has 560 pages already. So David, maybe you have to write more books. So please do read this book. For my generation, at least, it's a revealing, academically rigorous look at the events and the processes that we lived through and could help to give us a better perspective of what we saw. For younger people, I hope it's, I trust that it's a brilliant introduction to a time of hope, a period when there was real hope of change. And I hope it becomes an inspiration, that it also broadens their thinking and makes them become apostles of development themselves. Thank you. Thank you very much.
When we confuse Harvard with hard work, you need more apostles, Otherwise, there's total confusion here. One thing which I wanted to mention, David, is that we are sovereign. So you use that triumph of labor on your cover. I think with the Penguin did it without any acknowledgement. Now that's a 1959. It's in fact quite a sacred monument of Devi Prasad Roy Chaudhary on Marina Beach in Chennai.
With a replica actually in the National Gallery of Modern Art.
Yeah, that's a replica here. But it's been used in your cover without any. No, nothing. So in that poster when IIC made it, we saw to it that was there. Anyway, David, you weave a group portrait of these economists, emphasizing their lifelong friendships and intellectual exchanges, rooted in their shared Cambridge experience. Now, their diverse approaches, Sen's human development focus, Bhagwati's trade liberalization advocacy, Manmohan Singh's policy reforms, Huck's Human Development Index creation, Sobhan's equity-driven work, and Jayawardena's institution leadership illustrate a rich tapestry of ideas that shape developmental theory, practice. This book's narrative of personal and professional bonds adds a human dimension to economic history. So we thank you for that. Now I'd like to request Montek to please take the floor.
Well, let me thank the publisher and the organizers for inviting me. I want to join what Shankar in saying what he did about the book. It's really a lovely book. I mean, the first job of somebody who's speaking at a panel is to give some people the idea, the audience the idea, that is the book actually worth reading? It really is. And I think Shankar brought out why it's not kind of a narrow history of what Manmohan Singh did and what Mahbub did and various other people did. It's actually quite a rich tapestry of how ideas evolved. And this rather unique circumstance that you had 6 guys from South Asia all sort of filtering through this top university and then interacting with each other and getting into government and so on. Now, interestingly, their subsequent careers are actually quite different in the sense that Manmohan Singh was the only one who, I mean, he had very brief stints abroad, basically went back and worked in government. And one of the nice things about the book, which I mean, I found quite informative, because I had got to know him, working under him, from about 1980 onwards. But I didn't know very much about what he was doing during the 70s. And this book actually brings together a lot of stuff, papers that he has written, one of which I've seen, and the other one which he says even he hasn't seen, but it exists somewhere, which gives you a sense of what his thinking was. That's actually for Indian sort of scholars or people interested in the evolution of Indian economic policy is very important, because it does indicate that although as a civil servant, he obviously worked under constraints, he was writing about the need to kind of do things differently. And that was there in these papers. I mean, I'm aware of some of that in the 80s, and I've written about it, so I won't go on and on about this. But, you know, one issue which I think is very important is that ideas didn't actually come out of the kind of fully developed West and then were just picked up. You know, the best thing to look at there is this whole business of poverty, which is now all over the place. And this morning's newspaper says some new data, whatever, the poverty line has been recalculated. Now, you know, when you go back in India, I mean, it was Dadabhai Naoroji, way back, the poverty of un-British rule, 20 or something like that. So in India, the tradition of worrying about poverty is actually very old. Even if you come to more recent times, and this is connected with what happens later on in the World Bank, because I think the book mentions that McNamara, Anne Hollis Chenery, and Mahbub Haq also were keen to sort of bring the issue of the bank's job is to make sure that the poor benefit. Okay, my feeling, by the way, is that that was dominantly motivated. I don't think David quite says that, but dominantly motivated by McNamara's realization that the old argument for development assistance, which is that you've got to save the world from communism, wasn't going to work anymore. Because communism was no more an expansionist force. I mean, it didn't collapse until 1991. But, you know, by the time of the 1970s, it was pretty obvious that none of the developing countries were going to go communist. So if the name of the game was to stop these guys from going communist, you didn't need any World Bank assistance. But I think they felt that, you know, a lot of poor people, and development isn't getting to the poor. That idea, by the way, also originated in India. It's very sad that our intellectual classes don't actually look at our own history. This idea can be traced back to Ram Manohar Lohia, of all people. Because in 1962, just after the Chinese attack and Panditji was under a lot of pressure, Ram Manohar Lohia made his maiden speech in the Lok Sabha. And in that maiden speech, he was very critical of the government, which you're talking about growth. Where's this growth? Where is it? I don't see it anywhere. The poor aren't benefiting. Maybe the top are getting it all, etc., etc. He then went on to say that, you know, China is different. Mind you, China had just attacked India. So it's quite bold of him to say China is different. You know, over there, you know, you can see that people are getting better off, but in India, they're not. Now, the interesting thing is that Panditji, being the kind of person he was, I think this is the first time. Oh, no, Ram Manohar Lohia said, I'm sure the Prime Minister has no idea at what level the people of India live. I don't know if he realized that they live on less per day than it costs to feed the Prime Minister's dog. This is in the Lok Sabha record. So Panditji is a very sensitive guy, and he sort of said, is that really true? Because nobody had told him. So he set up a whole committee in the Planning Commission to go into the issue of what is the distribution of income? I mean, how much do people eat and so on? And this lot came to the conclusion that, you know, we don't measure it. We only measure consumption. So the Prime Minister had to be told there are no official data on the distribution of income. Now, this is way back in maybe 1964. We have just appointed, a few months ago, the first official Indian committee which is going to work out how to do a survey to calculate the distribution of income. And my good friend Sujit Bhalla is made chairman of the committee. So I keep telling him, you have no idea what a historic job you've been assigned. And when this committee has done its work, we'll have an official assessment of what is income. Now, the interesting thing is that I was in the World Bank at the time working under Hollis Chenery. Hollis wanted to sort of go into this whole issue of income distribution and who benefits from it and this and that. And he was a very sort of eclectic kind of person. And he collected a whole bunch of people, most of whom figure in this book. All the sort of, guys from the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, etc., had a big conference in order to discuss how should one move forward. And the interesting thing is that he was aware, in fact, I had told him, but he was actually aware, that the Indian Planning Commission, following this directive from the Prime Minister that we must make sure that people benefit, had produced a document called the Perspective Plan for Getting Rid of Poverty. I don't remember the exact title. And it said, can we get rid of poverty in 20 years? And it did a lot of calculations. And it came to the conclusion that, look, we have such a low level of income that we cannot do it through redistribution alone. Not possible. So if you want to get rid of poverty, you've got to grow the economy. And they said that, if the economy grew at 7%, per year, 7%, then over 20 years, most people, in those days, almost 60% were below the poverty line. Most people would get above the poverty line. But the bottom 2 deciles would still be below the poverty line. So for them, you'd have to get something extra done. So this was a notion of getting rid of poverty by pushing for growth, but also doing something for the very poor who'd be left out. And Hollis Chenery, we ended up producing a book called Redistribution with Growth, which kind of widely regarded in those days as the World Bank's mantra. But to the credit of Hollis Chenery, he actually in his preface mentioned that this book is inspired by the work done in the Indian Planning Commission, which set up for the first time a growth model, which said how much growth do we need and what is needed to get rid of poverty and this and that and the other. I used to find it particularly annoying, by the way, later on, when everybody described everything we were doing as you borrowed it all from the World Bank, when the World Bank document on redistribution with growth attributed it all to work being done earlier in India. Now, I won't go on and on about this, but I think there's a related issue, and I think we are really too close to what's happening in neighboring countries. We're too close to what's happening in other developing countries at large, Africa, Latin America, East Asia. But we're quite close to what's happening next door. Because here you have these 6 apostles all coming out of India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, in those days, East Pakistan. But you would think that most people in India would be very aware of what are the economic problems of Pakistan. Why is it now being described as a basket case? What went wrong, etc., etc. Similar issues on Bangladesh, same sort of thing. Sri Lanka has gone through very difficult times because of their internal political strife. But I don't find that at all in our newspapers. Except when there is an IMF program, which I think most of our journalists reflexively think is a news item worth putting on the page. We get no coverage of what's happening in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, Myanmar, anything. And what this book I think tells you a little bit is that we ought to be much more aware. And actually there'd be a lot of lessons for us to learn. If nothing else, we've had far fewer crises than these countries. If you go back, we went to the IMF in 1980, then we didn't go back to the IMF till 1991. And I recall that in the 1991 crisis, when we were congratulating ourselves, we said to the IMF sometime in 93, fine, the crisis is over, thanks a lot, thank you for what you did. And we sort of, as we walked out, we were saying that's really good not to be under the IMF supervision. And one of my colleagues said, don't worry, you'll be back there in 10 years. And I said, I'll take a bet with you. And the truth is that from 1991 to now, we have not had to go back to the IMF at all. Now, I mean, it's all very well to say this shows that the different governments all did good economic management. But you know, the best way of learning why we didn't is to find out why others did. Because all our neighbors have been routinely going back to the IMF. It would be nice if somebody were to write that, you know, the reason why we have a better experience is that we didn't make the mistakes that other countries did. And I think this is just a general point. Reading the book, I got a real sense that, you know, when you talk about Mahbub, you talk about the 22 families, the 23 families, his internal problems in Pakistan. In a way, the saddest story in the book is Rehman, because he was he's absolutely intellectually impeccable kind of guy, left-oriented, but had zero impact on his own country. But it didn't affect him. I mean, you know, he was the best disciple of Maurice Dobb, whose picture you put up there earlier. So I think I hope people read the book, and looking at the book, think of how would you analyze government experiments and experiences in future? Because you need to know who were the influences on whatever is moving policy. And this brings it out really extremely well. So David, thank you very much. I hope all these people will go and buy your book and read it, and I'm sure that if they do, they'll benefit. Thank you.
So can we have a formal launch? This is to be. Then we can go in for a short Q&A. Okay.
So how does one launch a book?
Yeah.
I don't have a bottle of champagne to crack over the bow. I'll get my copy.
Can I have ask the first question? There's a talk of in the book. In fact, there's less than a chapter, but it's very much there. Reform with stealth. Reform with stealth. Would you like to? What is this whole concept of reform with stealth? In fact, you coined the phrase, is it? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I coined the phrase, but I certainly used it, and probably earlier than most. I used it really to describe Mr. Narasimha Rao's approach to bringing about reforms, because I do think that Dr. Manmohan Singh was the architect of that. I mean, he was the one who actually knew what to do, but I don't think he could have done it, as he himself often said, if he hadn't got the support of the Prime Minister. But I think that Mr. Rao was not a great believer in sort of big bang reforms, nor was Dr. Singh. I mean, they were in that sense both gradualists, and I regard myself also as a gradualist. I mean, if you have a big system, one of my friends who was in shipping said that, you know, the turning circle of a small boat is much smaller than a big liner. So you have to accept the fact that if you're steering a very large vessel, it's going to take time for it to turn. But I think in India, the reform by stealth really meant that we're going to turn, but we're not actually going to tell you that we're going to turn. I mean, I felt that gradualism meant that you say, look, we have to reduce duties. They are this much now. We're going to reduce them 4 percentage points per year, so that in 10 years' time, they'll go down to whatever. Our approach was, our duties are too high, and we're reducing them, and we must do more. But you don't tell them how much more, at what time will you get to what. And that was really sort of an opportunistic approach. It's like you kind of say you're going to do it, but you don't give people a clear direction. And I call that reform by stealth. That is, you are going to reform, but you're going to do it when you can do it. And that's different, in my view, from gradualism, because gradualism gives clear signals so everybody can actually plan for it. Now, mind you, the argument in favor of reform by stealth is that people say that if you give clear signals, then it allows all the opponents that much time to lobby against it. And frankly, that's true. So in the end, those of you that become ministers will have to make up your mind how much stealth and how much gradualism and how much transparency. But that's what gradualism, that's what reform by stealth really meant.
So we could pick up some questions. Yeah, go, yeah, just one sec. Yeah, please.
Several, you, David, and others also echoed this idea that it was a time of hope in the 50s, 60s, when the apostles were doing their bit. And what is ironical is, of course, speaking for India, that this was precisely the period when the hope was being destroyed. And it was only the real possibilities that you spoke about came only after 1991. So I was wondering, actually, reading the title of your book, Lessons from Modern Development Practices, why don't you write another book which is really based on the success, that lessons we can learn from East Asia and China. In other words, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and now China, and now latest will be Vietnam.
I think it's a very good question. Honestly, if I were to think of the lessons for South Korea, from South Korea and Taiwan, for their developmental success, is be what the Americans called at the time a frontline state. Right, some large portion, I think over half of Taiwanese industrial investment in the 1950s came from the United States. South Korea was similarly inundated with flows of US funds. So I think it's worthwhile looking at the economic models that were in play. And in fact, in the original version of the project, before it became only South Asian, I was actually interested in looking at a Taiwanese economist who was behind the market reforms of the 1950s. But the lesson is not quite a simple policy lesson. The lesson is, I guess I would say, an accident of history in this case.
Accident of history in country after country after country that
Well,
adopted a simple formula of exporting labor-intensive manufacturers. It can't be an accident of history, David. It is a policy. And that's where we failed, and they succeeded. And that's a story worth talking about, and
Okay.
writing about, and learning about from.
In my next book.
Thank you. May I point out that apart from Japan, which was being ruled by MacArthur to start with after the war, all the persons, all the countries you enumerated, who was the so-called East Asian tigers, they turned out to be man-eaters.
I think I'll leave that dispute for the front row, and just stand back from it, if that's okay.
I just wanted to say that these 6 economists lived at a time where the orientation was so humane and human, so they were able to espouse the human cause, and you've written lessons for modern development practices from the global south. Because if today they were the survivors and born today's world, in this digital virtual world, they wouldn't be what they were. We'd have different economists.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So, weaving this biography between six of these very eminent people, all probably the same age group, is brilliant, of course. So there was something said by Dr. Ahluwalia that one wishes that there were more sort of examination of practices with our very, very close neighbors. I was just wondering, having been in government all my life, that did we ever give credence? Did we ever bother about our neighbors? And now we are in a very, very high state of arrogance, in my opinion, if you agree with that. So do our neighbors look at us and look at our experiences? Mr. Engerman, you could throw light upon that. Because I don't think we do. I haven't been a prime minister, but I don't think we have ever had a look at what people are experiencing just beyond the borders. Thanks. Ma'am.
I mean, well, one example, actually, the example I would cite belongs to a person right over here, which is Montec's M document, completed on the way back as a result of a visit to Malaysia. Is that right? Yeah. As far as I see, when Indian economic policymakers look for outside examples, they look to the Asian tigers, as was suggested, and then the sort of next generation of them, or it might have included Malaysia and now Vietnam. Vietnam, obviously not in the 20th century, but there were continuing efforts, but I think they were fairly lonely efforts, particularly Rehman Sobhan's effort to build a kind of South Asian intellectual network and a research network, but it has never really worked fully. I think of necessity, Sri Lanka follows more of what's going on in India than vice versa. India is a very large market and a very important trading partner, and always has been, far more important than Sri Lanka has been to India. So I think India's size makes it more difficult to put it at the center of, its neighbors at the center of their discussions. Whereas, so it builds an asymmetry into it. And that's, of course, leaving aside the security ongoing, long-standing security concerns of Indo-Pakistan relations, which go far beyond anything economic, obviously.
Yeah, good. You just take two more, that's all, huh? Time. You just hold on to that. Yeah, go ahead.
When Sheikh Hasina was the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Bangladesh was seen as an economic success story. And often we were told that we need to emulate some examples from there. But as soon as she has been ousted, suddenly we see it as an economic disaster case. Why has this change happened?
Well, I don't know that the two are entirely inconsistent. I mean, I think Bangladesh really picked up on ready-made garments at a crucial moment, in the same way that the Asian tigers had this advantage of being a first mover into things like garments and textiles, and then worked their way up the value chain from there. Bangladesh had remarkable success with ready-made garments. The other factor that has been true across South Asia has been the result of the 1973 oil crisis, which is the rise of labor migration to the Gulf, right? Anyone who boards a flight in Delhi or Colombo or Bangalore or Dhaka for the Gulf sees this labor migration still going strong, but it's now coming on 40, almost 50 years in duration. But one of the reasons Sheikh Hasina's time has been seen as a disaster, for those who see it that way, is corruption and self-enrichment. But that self-enrichment required that money flowing into the country in the first place. So I don't know that that the sort of, I guess what critics would call crony capitalism of Bangladesh necessarily erases the positive impact of ready-made garments and labor migration as kind of crucial elements of Bangladesh's economic turn. Remember that in 1971, they essentially had no economy at all. Rehman Sobhan and his colleagues took charge of the Planning Commission with abandoned factories, with most of the bridges destroyed, most of the river transportation gone. Richard Nixon, no economic expert to be sure, called Bangladesh a basket case, and so the fact that it could be doing anything and come in for any praise only 3 decades later, I think, is worth taking some pride in, even if the economic situation is not sustainable. One of the things I think comes up as a sub-theme in all these conversations is that this economic development is a very dynamic process, and the lessons of one moment are not necessarily the lessons of another. And I suppose that's what I meant in my reply about accident of history, that by moving at the moment that they did, right, when within the United States, for instance, textile firms were closing down or moving offshore, is what gave this advantage that was not available to India 20 or 30 years later. This very dynamic system means that your lessons can't be too historical. It's hard for me as a historian to even say that, but you really need to be ready to move with the times.
Yeah, no, just on the Bangladesh point, I just want to mention that as it happens, Dr. Manmohan Singh was very aware of what was happening across the border in Bangladesh. And I recall on one occasion when the Bangladeshi finance minister was calling on Dr. Singh, having a conversation, and usually we are prepared to have answers to questions he might ask in case the finance minister needs that information. Although Manmohan Singh knew more than most of us, but still that's what our preparation was about. But Dr. Singh surprised all of us by saying to him that, I've been following what you've been doing and reducing duties in Bangladesh, and it seems to be doing quite well. Now, we had not briefed him on that. So maybe he just read the Financial Times. But, I think we don't know what's happening. And we need to do that big time, not just in this particular case, to know what's working. Because I think the whole trade performance of Bangladesh during the last, 20 years and so on, is really a reflection of them having consciously done these reforms. But more generally, I think even to be aware of what the problem is, how do you recover from a crisis? Sri Lanka, they're very aware of the need. I've been invited there myself a year ago because they said, look, we seem to be having a crisis. We're dealing with IMF. Can you come and help us? Tell us, how did you do it? So there is a latent, there's a job to be done there, which is to tell the story across the border.
Yeah, go ahead.
Namaste. David, congratulations for your book and all the very best with the prompts you have received. And Shiv Shankar sir, Montek sir, I was really eager to listen to both of you, and I would like to wish you all the best.
Another question, please.
I do not have a question, only good compliments.
Nowadays,
please
questions are
my
called
question.
prompts.
Oh, sorry.
So she said prompts.
Prompts.
Go ahead, Vice Chancellor.
My good luck, can I finish with my compliment?
No, that's okay. Enough now. Come on.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
please,
good
thank you.
wishes and good
Yeah.
luck.
Vice Chancellor, thank you. Come. Yeah, take the mic, please. Just one sec, sir.
I said I want to take up the first point that was made from the audience. Who were the apostles of development in China? And did they go to Cambridge? I know that Cambridge did wonderful work in molecular biology in 60s and 70s, but did it do so well in economics?
By the 60s and 70s, they were remaking themselves. I would describe it in the 50s and for much of the 60s as they were still living in the 1930s as an economics faculty. But they did adapt, and of course, there are prominent economists the world over, not least from India, who studied at Cambridge in the 60s. The question about does China have a set of apostles? They don't have one, but there is, for instance, a very famous boat ride, a week-long boat ride, forgetting down which river. The Yangtze, that had something like 25 Western economists, and then the leading both economists and economic bureaucrats in the Chinese Communist Party. In 1997, 98. Yes, there's one, and then there's an earlier, smaller version as well. So I think China went about its approach to economic expertise differently. It was quieter, it was unofficial, and it took place on home turf. It didn't happen as much by sending their scholars overseas, at least in those moments.
I just want to add to that, Pentel Saab, that, that's my own impression. And if you want, Vogel's book on Deng Xiaoping gives this to you in great detail. They did a lot of work thinking about who's succeeding. As David said, they had this lovely boat ride. I forget the name of the boat, but they went up and down the river with all these foreign economists. And they themselves say that originally their thinking was that they would go with the Hungarian guys who had a sort of midway between neither plan nor free and so on. But actually the Americans persuaded them that this doesn't work. And as a matter of fact, later on, there was a Russian economist who came to India to give give a lecture. And he was making a comment about the Indian concept of the mixed economy, which was very popular. And he translated it as the mixed up economy, which I thought was very appropriate. But just one more point. My personal experience, this is going back to the 80s, the Chinese were very keen to learn about what's happening in Korea, South Korea. But there were political difficulties in kind of doing that. So they told the World Bank, these are some of the key jobs that the World Bank plays, by the way. They told the World Bank, why don't you organize a conference in Bangkok and call all the neighboring Asian economies, including India, and bring the Koreans also. And we'll talk to the Koreans on the side, okay? And there's a wonderful conference where the Chinese were saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Mr. Rajiv Gandhi had decided to send Dr. Manmohan Singh as his representative. He was then deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. I was a flunky in his office, so I went along with Manmohan. And everybody was saying whatever they were saying. And at one point, Dr. Singh asked the Chinese guy that, what you're saying makes a lot of sense from an economic point of view. But don't you think it's going to increase inequality? To which the Chinese guy said, yes, we've got too much equality. That's what I call clarity. My wife visited China, my late wife visited China a couple of times, and her impression was India is an open society with a closed mind. China is a closed society with an open mind. This is very, very true. I visited Beijing when I was deputy chairman. Jaishankar was our ambassador. And I asked to have dinner with the vice chancellor of which is the university in... No, the other one. Tsinghua. I wanted to know about this 1,000 sort of scholar talents program where they were picking out famous Chinese scholars from around the world and inviting them back. So I said, this is terrific, we should do the same thing. What do you do? So the guy says, one thing is we don't advertise a position or anything and wait for applications, which, by the way, is a very sensible thing because in Oxford, the most prestigious professorship is the Regius Professor of History. And somebody once asked somebody, how do you choose the Regius Professor of History? So he said that under the statute, we have to invite applications. So we do that. Everybody who applies, we throw away all those applications because we are not looking for people who want a job. having rejected everybody summarily, we then decide who do we want and then reach out to them. Okay? So the Chinese did exactly the same thing. And I said, but what happens? I mean, we negotiate the salary. So we know that they can't come at the same salary that we are paying guys in Beijing, but they don't necessarily want the same salary they're getting in America. Somewhere in between, you can attract them back for 3 years, 4 years, etc. So I said, but when you do that, and he said, sometimes, they say, my wife is also a librarian, so I can't come and you can give her a job. So we create a job for her. So I said to him, don't you find that the existing faculty get very upset? He said, yeah. He said, but Mr. Ahluwalia, you have to distinguish a dragon from a fish. So he clearly didn't think we were capable of distinguishing dragons from fishes. And that is the answer to Shiv Shankar's question, that how did we get all these great guys to come? And can we do it again? Remember, Amartya Sen was made head of the Department of Economics at the age of 24. Today, if you try to attract someone of his qualifications, they would say, well, normally you would be an assistant professor, but maybe we'll give you 2 increments. I mean, it's not going to work.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Now we ask Dr. Munshi, can you do the honors?
I've been given this responsibility to propose a vote of thanks. I would once again like to address all the distinguished speakers, colleagues and guests. On behalf of all of us, I extend heartfelt thanks to Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, Dr. Manmohan Singh Ahluwalia, and Professor David Ingerman for this deeply engaging and illuminating conversation. Your insights have not only enriched our understanding of the apostles of development, but also challenged us to think the very purpose of development in our own times. My sincere thanks to Sri Suhas Borkar for steering the dialogue with depth and clarity, and to our wonderful audience, thank you for your presence and attention, and discussions like this remind us why these ideas matter. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.